Alright, hello and welcome to the next video of this tutorial series about leafcutter ants. Today we're going to talk about population control. I know a lot of people have been waiting for this video. I've got a lot of requests when it came to population control with Atta Ants, and I want to talk about it. I need to tell you quite a few information about harvesting behavior of leafcutter ants before I can tell you about how to do population control. So yeah, let's get right into it. Now, I need to tell you a couple of basic things. Some things might be very basic, some things I didn't know for a long time about leafcutter ants, and it eventually helped me a lot to find out about how to control population with leafcutter ants. Now, how does it happen in nature? You know, what I can tell you, a lot of it is from research and on the internet, you know. I found information, but a lot of it is also just from observations with my colony. So these are leafcutter ants. Those leafcutter ants are Atta sextans. I cannot tell you if it's true for all Atta species, but I can tell you that it works for Atta sextans. Now, how does it work with leafcutter ants? Now, with the whole harvesting behavior. Now, what we know about them is that, you know, they spend some time here. You can see them here. Let's see if I can get a close-up somewhere. They're working here. Maybe it's out of focus right now, but you can imagine, you know, they're working here on those leaves. They're cutting leaves outside in the outworld. They're gathering as many as they can. They collect it and then they carry it all the way into the nest. That's the entrance of the nest. That's where they bring the leaves. There's always during daytime there's always a constant road of ants traveling in and out, bringing in leaves and going back to the cutting process and moving into the nest. What happens if they go into the nest? Now let's have a look. The first what they do is those ants that have harvested the leaves, they go here into the first chamber of the nest and they just drop their leaves. That's the storage area. That's where they bring all the leaves that they have cutted, and they deposit here for the ants working in the nest to pick it up. And what happens afterwards is that the ants from the nest, those that are in charge of cultivating the fungus, out of focus right now, yeah, they will go and gather the leaves that are in the storage area of the nest, bring it into the fungus chambers and start working on it and processing the leaves so they can be placed on the fungus and the fungus can grow. That's the basic process. What is important to know about this process another thing that is important to know about it is that the amount of ants outside of the nest is much smaller than the amount of ants inside the nest. That's very important, and you need to remember that. I'd say even though it looks like quite a few ants outside in the outworld, there's always ants walking around and so on. There's always something going on. But in the end, still, for every ant that is outside in the nest, there are I'd say around 20 ants inside the nest. I don't know the exact numbers. I didn't make the study and didn't manage to count them. But even if you're counting optimistically, I think you will not find more than, at the moment, maybe 500 ants outside of the nest. But inside the nest, I know that this colony has around 20,000 ants. So there are far more ants inside the nest than outside the nest. That has to do with risk management. They have to think about how many ants can we risk having outside. Outside is the danger zone, so to speak, because inside the nest they are quite protected and they need enough ants inside the nest to care for the brood, care for the fungus, and also protect the colony if they get attacked by another ant colony or something like that. So it's always risky to have too many ants outside at the same time. That's why they limit the amount of ants that are outside at any given time. And my estimate is that it's around 5% of ants that are outside, and the rest is inside. Now, there is more to it than just that. That's the very basic information. One thing that there are a few things that can be observed. For example, especially when the colony was younger, what I experienced is that, well, it's still nowadays, it's that there are far more ants outside during daytime than at night. There are some ants harvesting leaves at nighttime, but the numbers are just much lower. And when the colony was smaller, like a year ago or something like that, there were no ants outside at nighttime. They were just harvesting at daytime, and they would shut up the harvesting process at night. And now that the colony has grown a little, they started harvesting at night as well. But this is natural behavior for a lot of ant species. A lot of ant species either harvest during nighttime or during daytime, and this has to do that it makes sense for ants to evolve this way with other ant species, so that some ant species harvest at daytime, other ant species are out at nighttime, so they don't come into conflict with each other. That just makes a lot of sense for ant colonies. There's a lot of harvesting going on here as well, but it's hard to get it in focus. Anyway. Now, if you try to find out a little bit more about ants and how ants in general, but Atta, leafcutter ants, if you read about them in the wild, the colony is actually something that people have observed, that for the first 3 years of a colony usually remains very small. Usually they don't have any soldiers. For 3 years they are only like a couple of thousand maximum after 3 years, which is amazing, because we know that leafcutter ants, Atta especially, can grow into huge numbers in a very short period of time. So why do they stay as small as they do? Now, this has a lot to do with, again, with risk management. The thing is, if you have like 5% of ants, if you are willing to send like 5% of your ants outside harvesting. Now, if you have a large colony, this is absolutely no problem. If you have 1 million ants, you can send 50,000 ants at the same time outside harvesting. 50,000 ants can do a lot of harvesting. 50,000 ants can gather a huge amount of leaves in a very short period of time. Even if you're a smaller colony of like 100,000 ants, you still can send out 5,000 ants at any given time, and that's quite a number. And again, you will have a lot of leaf material inside your nest. But if you're a very young colony, just started, like having, maybe the queen has started and had a claustral start, so she managed to raise the first generation of ants. Maybe she has 10 workers at that time. And now 5%, there's already a problem, because there would be only half an ant. But of course, you cannot send out a half an ant. You need to send up more, at least one. And if you send only one ant at the same time, this one ant will be very vulnerable, because there's no protection of a group. So what happens in nature is that smaller colonies, they are very careful with how many times and how many ants they send out. They limit their harvesting processes to a minimum. They send a couple of ants out now and again to get a couple of leaves, and then they stay inside the nest for a long period of time. They just try to harvest as many leaves as they need to have a steady growth rate, a slow growth rate, and not risk too much. Because if you lose like 3 or 4 ants in the founding stage, that can be the end of your colony, right? So you have to be very careful with your resources. So even if you have 100 ants, you might send a couple of ants at a couple of times, maybe one hour per day. You send a couple of them out to harvest, and that's what happens in nature. And they try to minimize the risk, so they try to grow as a colony, but they grow very slowly in order to not risk too much losses, or not risk losing half of the colony at the same time. So they send out very few, and only maybe once a day or something like that. And so the colony grows very slowly for the first 3 years. And after 3 years, usually around 3 years, a critical number is reached, a critical population number is reached, that you can take more risks. Maybe you have like 3, 4, 5,000 ants, and now all of a sudden you can take a little more risks and send more out, and for longer periods of time. And then that's when the time when the colonies really start to grow, and eventually they will send even more ants out, and they stop sending them out just at daytime. They will send some of them out at nighttime as well, and that's when you get those huge colonies. Now the question is, why do ants behave so differently in captivity than they do in the wild? Why do they not do the same, well, show the same behavior? Because we know of stories of people keeping atta, and within 1 year they had a colony of 1 million workers or a couple of 100,000 workers. And that's why so many people say that keeping atta is almost impossible, because the colony will explode within a very short period of time. And it's obvious that that atta has the possibility to grow very, very fast if it's unchecked. Now, why is the difference between what happens in captivity and what happens in the wild? Now, I have a theory about that. I'm not 100% sure if it's right, but I personally believe in that theory. I haven't made any tests, but it's what I experienced with my colony and what I've read about. So my theory is that the problem is that most ant keepers keep them in the classical setup. That's something like that, you know. This setup here, we have 3 chambers. You have 1 garbage chamber, 1 fungus chamber, 1 outworld chamber, let's call it outworld chamber, where you give them the leaves. I have more chambers here. There are more chambers coming over there. There's another fungus chamber there, but that's because the colony has already a certain size. But that's what most ant keepers start with, you know, 3 chambers. And the problem about that is that, of course, as an ant keeper, you clearly define each chamber. So you say that this is the garbage chamber, this is the fungus chamber, and this is the outworld. And for you, it's very clear that this here is the outworld, because that's where you offer them the leaves, right? But for the ants, that is not as clear, because, you know, I believe from the perspective of an ant, these are just 3 chambers of their nest. If you would be able to ask the ant, he probably would tell you, this is the garbage chamber, this is the fungus chamber, and this is the storage chamber, not the outworld, the storage chamber, because it is very similar than the other chambers. It is closed. It usually has the same light conditioning. Maybe it's of course it's drier probably, but depending on how many leaves they're in, that can be quite humid as well. But the temperatures are around the same. The light is the same, and it's also a closed box. It's a closed area. So in the eyes of the ant, this is just a storage chamber. So harvesting in the storage chamber is not really harvesting. It's just getting the leaves from the storage chamber to the fungus. So there's no risk involved. You don't have to go outside. You just get the leaves that are in the storage chamber. And you can do that. You can send all your ants at the same time if you want to. It's still in the nest. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to worry about day or nighttime. It's just because during the nest, here's the same thing. You know, at nighttime, if I go to the outworld, there's hardly any activity at nighttime. But inside here, there's even more activity at nighttime, because there are more ants inside the nest, because all the ants that usually are out in the outworld harvesting, they are now back in the nest, and they need something to do as well. So they help the ants here. So there's even more activity in the storage chamber at nighttime than at daytime. So they just keep on working. And what I experience very often is, you know, during daytime, the storage chamber fills up because the harvesting ants bring in more leaves than the ants can process. And at nighttime, the storage chambers, the amount of leaves in storage chambers decreases again, because then they can fetch up. So if you have this closed setup, in the eyes of the ants, they can immediately start working on those leaves. They don't limit the amount of harvesting times. They don't limit the amount of workers that are harvesting, because it's just inside the nest. They're just working their process. And that leads to an exploding colony, because if it's inside the storage chamber, then you can just use it. And I believe that's why the behavior is so different in captivity. Now, what do you have to change in order to get the same effects like in the wild? I believe you have to have an outworld that is clearly distinguishable from the nest area. So the ants really know that this is an outworld. This is not a nest area, not a part of the nest. It's not just a storage chamber where the leaves are. And how do you do that? No, I don't really know what the most important factor is, but I have different things. For example, especially during daytime. You know, I close the lid here, so it's darker in the nest. That's one thing I believe that helps them to distinguish between nest and outworld. That it's just there's less light, it's darker. And the other thing is that it's a closed area. You know, there are walls around it. It's not open, and it's limited in space. And those things, I believe, those things lead to for the ants. That means it's nesting area, right? So what I really recommend is have as soon as possible create a setup for your leafcutter ants that has a clearly different outworld. You know, like here, for example. This one is very open, there's more light here, less humidity, open space, and it is clearly, they behave differently when they're out here. They're also more nervous. You can see they are more nervous. You can see how they behave. If I try to, if I go into this part of the outworld and put my finger in, try to irritate them a little, what happens is a lot of ants there start running away. They're very nervous outside because this is the outworld. When I do the same thing down here, I'm not going to do that because they're going to attack me. If I put my finger in here, a lot of ants will crawl over me immediately, and there are some soldier ants among them, and they can actually bite quite hard. You can get bleeding hands if you do that. So they behave differently in the nest area than in the outworld. And I believe it's very important if you want to have population control. The first step is to create an outworld that is clearly distinguishable. Maybe if you cannot create a setup like this, maybe take a much larger container for the outworld. Make sure you cover up the nesting areas so it's darker inside there, and have a large area that is clearly distinguishable from the rest. How do you know if you succeeded by doing so? You know, for example, this is one thing. You know, you can see it from the behavior. If you have the ants running away from you and not attacking you when you put your fingers in, that's already a good sign. But it's not always the same because it depends on the ants. If I find a soldier ant out here, it will still attack me, of course. But the normal workers don't. But the bigger indicator that you succeeded by creating an outworld that is also considered an outworld by the ants is if they have a storage area inside the nest. So if you see that your ants are cutting leaves and then they carry it directly to the fungus and start processing it, then you probably haven't succeeded, because in there they don't really have a different kind of jobs. For them it's just storage, so they carry it might even be the fungus workers that are cutting the leaves right now and bring it to the fungus. If you can observe that behavior, that the ants that are cutting the leaves are actually coming into the nest and not bringing the leaves to the fungus, but drop it in a storage area, then you probably have succeeded. Then you probably has been successful. They believe that this is nest and the rest is outworld. So this is the best indicator to see if you have succeeded in creating an outworld that is really considered an outworld by the ants. Now, this is very important for population control because on one side, it limits the growth rate, especially for the smaller colonies. The smaller colonies will grow slower for the first 2-3 years. And that already is the first population control, right? But eventually, you will still reach a certain number, a critical number, where this alone doesn't help with population control. And there are more measurements of population control than just this one, but they're also depending on the first one, because the main thing how to control population is you can, as an ant keeper, you can limit the amount of leaves you offer them. Now, if they don't have enough leaves, they reduce the growth rate. That's very simple. Now, this works really well if you have an outworld like this. You know, if you really have an outworld that is considered an outworld by the ants, then you can just limit the amount of leaves you offer them, because in nature this is the same thing. At certain times, there is less food available in the outworld for the ants, and then they have to adjust their growth rate. Now, if you have a setup like I talked about it in the beginning, where you have just the 3 containers, and if you try to limit the amount of leaves you put in there, you know, you will have another problem, completely different problem. because you have, again, you have to think like an ant, think like a leafcutter ant. What happens if there are no more leaves inside the storage area? That means, okay, we have to go outside in the outworld and get more leaves. That's what they think about, you know. And then that's where the trouble really starts, because then you have ants that have their mind set up on escaping, because they want to get into the outworld. They want to get more leaves into the storage area. So they try to get out of your system. They try to find a way into the outworld. And if your ants, if leafcutter ants, especially Atta, if they have their mindset on escaping, they will find a way. You can be sure about it. I've seen pictures of them chewing through metal mesh, chewing through tubings. They can chew through almost everything. Their mandibles are so strong. And if your leafcutter ants want to escape, they usually eventually find a way to escape. And if you have a closed area, a storage area where you offer them the leaves, and there are not enough leaves in there for them, then they will try to escape, and that will be troublesome, I can tell you for sure. And but if you have an outworld that is clearly distinguishable from the nest, if you limit the amount of leaves you offer them in the outworld, the scouts will come back and say there's not much food out there, and the colony will behave completely differently. They will not try to escape. They will reduce the growth rate, because if in the outworld there's not enough food in the outworld, there's nothing they can change. You know, if there's not enough food in the storage, they can change by getting into the outworld, getting more leaves. If there's nothing more in the outworld, they have to adjust their growth rate. And that's the thing, you know. I limit the amount of leaves I give them. I offer them quite a few leaves, maybe once or twice a week maximum. And there's always a couple of days, 1 or 2 days, every time where there are hardly any leaves left. And the thing is, you know, my setup actually is not very it's not escape proof. It's a very open setup. There's just those, I've been asked a lot about how do we keep them from escaping. There's pet foil here, and the pet foil is covered with paraffin oil, and that keeps them from escaping. Maybe I'll show it here, you can see it better here. And that keeps them from escaping, but you can see the pet foil is not very high. It's like maybe 10 centimeters. And the thing about paraffin oil is just if your ant really want to escape, they can still do it, you know. They don't like walking over paraffin oil. They hate it. But if they want to escape, by all means, they can still walk over paraffin oil. But I hardly have any escapees. And even if in times when there are hardly any leaves, the ants are not trying to escape, because it's just a different mindset, you know. It's just, yeah, if there's no leaves in the outworld, we have to adjust. If there's no leaf in the storage, we have to go and find some. So if you want to control your population with the amount of leaves you offer them, you really have to make sure that your outworld is really considered an outworld by the ants. Yes, and I think with those two measurements, you can already control the growth rate of your colony quite well. And you can keep them at a couple of 10,000s without too much problem, without too much hustle. And that's the way you can keep Atta's extents. That's the way you can keep Atta, because if you have millions of ants, that's only, if you're not a professional zoo, there's no way you can keep, or yeah, maybe if you have a lot of space and a lot of money to invest into creating a setup that is suitable for such a colony. If you don't have that, there's no way you can keep a colony of a couple of millions. But this way, I think everyone can keep a colony of Atta. Of course, this setup is quite large, but it's still, you know, it's manageable. It's not that huge. And I think most apartments and most houses have space for something like that. And there are also, if you still need to control the population even more, there are a couple of other measurements you can do that. I don't really recommend them, but it's still possible. You can, for example, just offer them one kind of leaf. If you cut on the diversity of food they have, they will get fed up with the same leaves again and again, and they will reduce the cutting. But I don't think it's a very good thing to do, because don't think it leads to a very healthy colony or a very healthy fungus, but it's still a possibility. The other possibility is to keep temperatures low, around 20, 22 degrees Celsius, and the colony will grow slower at those temperatures. And that is also something that is possible, but for that you probably need aircon. Depending on where you live, you need aircon, and that's also something I wouldn't recommend. It's just a waste of energy, and I wouldn't do that. It's just that those are just other possibilities. Those are two possibilities that happen naturally in winter here, because in winter temperatures are lower here in my apartment. Also, the other thing is I have less diversity of leaves that I can offer them, because in winter there are just not as many plants that are green. So I have a natural population control during winter time, but I don't really like that kind of population control, because I prefer the one that I just can control the amount of leaves I offer them, and that helps a lot. So I think that's the main thing to consider. If you want to have, you can have a good population control. You can have control over the population of your colony, but it needs you to take some measurements. It needs a setup that is created in a way with a clear, distinguishable outworld that the ants consider an outworld. Then you have a lot of possibilities to control your population. As soon as the ants consider every part of your setup as part of their nest, it will be very difficult to control the population. Yes, that's about population control. As I said, if done the right way, it's quite easy to control an Atta colony, and everyone can keep one. You just have to consider a couple of things. Now, the next video will be about escape measurements and some other information. I'm sorry for the last two videos there have been very long, but there's a lot of things to talk about. The next videos will be shorter, I'm sure about it. If you want to see the next tutorials, just subscribe and hit the bell icon, then you get informed as soon as I have them ready. And yeah, thank you for watching. I'm always happy for comments. If you have something you disagree on, or if you have a question or additional information, feel free to write a comment. I try to answer them as good as I can, as always, and see you around. Thank you very much.